In the bustling streets of Detroit, Linda Johnson, a powerful attorney known for her unyielding fight for justice, finds herself caught in an unexpected confrontation. What begins as a routine traffic stop quickly spirals into a tense standoff with Officer Rick Thompson, a man hardened by years of policing and haunted by his tragic past. As the situation escalates, Linda's resolve is tested like never before. She faces the full force of a system corrupted by bias and prejudice. Yet, through it all, her unbreakable spirit shines as she not only defends herself but also exposes a deeper, more insidious corruption within the city's police department. Linda's journey takes us from a moment of unjust suspicion to a powerful movement for change. Her fight is not just personal, it becomes a beacon of hope for all those wronged by a broken system. This gripping story of resilience, redemption, and the pursuit of justice will leave you questioning the very foundations of right and wrong, and remind you that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Rick Thompson had been patrolling these streets for decades, his senses honed to detect the slightest ripple of trouble. The sight of a sleek red Ferrari blazing through downtown Detroit was more than just a spectacle, it was a neon sign flashing the word trouble. Thompson's instincts, shaped by countless encounters, screamed that something was off. He squinted, focusing on the driver, a young black woman whose composure seemed out of place behind the wheel of such a flashy car. The assumptions came quickly, as they always did. Black driver, luxury vehicle, late afternoon in a city known for its struggles. This could only mean one thing. In his mind, the situation was clear-cut, the pattern familiar. Another one, he muttered under his breath, a mix of frustration and resignation coloring his tone. Almost mechanically, his fingers reached for the switch that activated the patrol car's lights. The shrill wail of the siren cut through the din of the city as he weaved through traffic, his focus locked on the Ferrari ahead. For Thompson, this was a scene that had played out too many times to count. Intercept the car, search for contraband, and make the arrest. It was a routine that had become second nature, a sequence of events that rarely deviated from the script. But as he closed in on the Ferrari, something gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, something he couldn't quite place. There was a subtle difference in this encounter, a nuance that eluded his understanding. Perhaps it was the steady, unhurried way the driver navigated through the city, or the quiet confidence in her posture as she finally brought the car to a stop at a red light. Inside the luxurious vehicle, Linda Johnson's heart rate remained steady, her fingers gripping the leather steering wheel with a calm resolve. She had known this moment might come, and had even steeled herself for it. After all, driving a luxury car as a black woman often meant that suspicion and scrutiny were part of the journey. But today wasn't just another day on the road. Today, Linda wasn't merely a successful attorney, she was a warrior on a mission, driven by a fierce determination to fight for 3 young lives ensnared by a system that too often viewed them as disposable. Her purpose was clear, her resolve unbreakable. As she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and possibilities. She knew all too well the delicate dance required in these situations, the tightrope walk between asserting her rights and avoiding an escalation that could quickly turn dangerous. Thompson, meanwhile, was approaching the Ferrari with a sense of inevitability, his hand instinctively resting on his holster, a gesture that had become more of a habit than a necessity, yet one that revealed his deeply ingrained wariness. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. His gaze was steely, his expression unyielding as he peered through the tinted window of the car. He was prepared for resistance, for hostility, for the usual excuses he had heard 1,000 times before. But when Linda rolled down the window, meeting his gaze with a calmness that was almost disarming, Thompson felt a flicker of uncertainty, a feeling he was not accustomed to. license and registration, he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with years of experience on the force. Linda complied without hesitation, handing over her documents with a grace that belied the tension of the moment. Her eyes never left his, steady and unwavering, as if she had seen through him, through the layers of suspicion and prejudice that clouded his judgment. She knew the stakes and understood the fine line she had to walk. In her career as a lawyer, Linda had witnessed firsthand how quickly interactions with law enforcement could spiral out of control, especially when preconceived notions colored the encounter. She had seen lives destroyed by a single moment of misjudgment, and she was determined not to let that happen to her. Thompson glanced at the documents, his suspicion deepening as he tried to reconcile the information in front of him with the narrative he had already constructed in his mind. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone laced with a barely concealed accusation. It was more than a simple question, it was an indictment, a challenge to her right to be there, to occupy that space in that car. The implication was clear: someone like her had no business being in this part of town, driving a car that screamed wealth and privilege. "I'm here on business," Linda replied, her voice steady, her words carefully measured. "Is there a problem?" Officer, the calm in her voice was at odds with the tension in the air, a calm born of experience and an unshakable sense of purpose. But Thompson's mind was already working overtime, trying to piece together a story that made sense to him. "Business, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. What kind of business could someone like her possibly have in this part of town, driving a car like that? The pieces couldn't fit, because they didn't align with the narrow, preconceived notions he carried with him every day. His world was one of clear boundaries and rigid categories, where people were easily classified and understood through the lens of his experiences and biases. But here, in this moment, with this woman, the boundaries blurred, the categories faltered. Thompson found himself standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something he couldn't quite grasp, a world beyond the confines of his assumptions, a world that Linda Johnson navigated with the ease of someone who had long since learned to live with the weight of other people's prejudices. As he stood there, documents in hand, Thompson was confronted with a reality he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just another routine stop, another predictable encounter. It was a moment charged with possibilities, a crossroads where the paths of two very different lives intersected. Linda, sitting calmly in her Ferrari, was more than just a driver in a luxury car. She was a mother, a lawyer, a defender of the innocent, and a woman who had faced countless challenges head-on. And Thompson, standing there with his hand on his holster, was more than just a cop with a set of assumptions. He was a man grappling with a world that was far more complex than the one he had imagined. For a brief moment, the routine was shattered, and in its place, something new and uncertain took root, something that neither of them could fully understand, but that would linger long after the sirens had faded and the streets had returned to their usual rhythm. "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson commanded, his voice laced with an authority that left no room for negotiation. This wasn't just a standard traffic stop. His gut told him there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface that he had to uncover. The luxury car, the woman's unflinching composure, everything about her sent alarms blaring in his mind. Linda let out a quiet sigh, recognizing the inevitability of the situation. She knew the game, knew the dynamics at play, and she complied without protest, opening the door and stepping onto the cold pavement. She stood tall, her posture unyielding, projecting the same confident aura that had won her respect and victories in courtrooms nationwide. But this wasn't a courtroom, and Rick Thompson wasn't a judge. He was an enforcer, driven more by his prejudices than by any sense of true justice. Thompson's eyes darted over the car, scrutinizing every inch, as if the Ferrari itself was hiding a dark secret. He was convinced there was something here, something illicit that would justify the gnawing suspicion tightening his chest. "I'm going to search the vehicle," he announced, not even bothering to ask for her consent. It was more of a declaration than a request, an exertion of power that he felt entitled to wield. Linda remained still, watching him with a controlled fury bubbling just beneath her calm exterior. She knew the law. This was an illegal search, a violation of her rights. But she also knew that this wasn't the time to assert those rights, not here, not now. This wasn't the battle she needed to win. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. She watched as Thompson rifled through her belongings, his frustration growing with each empty compartment and clean glove box. His movements became more frantic, more aggressive, as the seconds ticked by with no sign of the contraband he was so sure he would find. Linda's items were scattered carelessly on the seat, tossed aside as irrelevant in his single-minded pursuit of evidence. But in the end, there was nothing. No drugs, no weapons, nothing that could justify his suspicions. Thompson's irritation was almost palpable as he slammed the trunk shut with a force that reverberated through the quiet street. He couldn't accept it, couldn't reconcile the reality before him with the narrative he had constructed in his mind. But he was out of options, out of explanations except for one. He reached for the handcuffs, his last resort. "You're coming with me," he stated coldly, his voice devoid of the usual satisfaction that came with making an arrest. There was no triumph in this moment, only a hollow sense of duty driven by his need to be right. He grabbed her wrists, pulling them behind her back with a roughness that spoke volumes about his frustration. Linda's eyes widened slightly, her mind racing through the implications of what was happening. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with the undercurrent of disbelief. Thompson didn't answer. He didn't need to, not in his mind. The metal cuffs clicked into place, biting into her skin as he tightened them without a second thought. He opened the back door of the patrol car and pushed her inside, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the silent night. As the car began to move, Linda stared out the window, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger, fear, and a sense of surreal disbelief. This was the system she had fought against her entire career, a system she knew all too well, but now she was experiencing it from the other side. Thompson glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze hardened, his mind racing with justifications. He had done the right thing, he told himself. The look in her eyes, the way she carried herself, he had seen it before, 1,000 times over. It wasn't just about the car or her composure, it was the whole package, the way she embodied something that didn't fit into the tidy boxes his world relied on. To him, it all screamed of something hidden, something dangerous, something that had to be rooted out. When they finally pulled into the station's parking lot, Thompson was still grappling with the gnawing need to justify his actions. He parked the car with a jerk and stepped out, yanking open the back door with a force that made the vehicle shudder. Linda remained silent, her demeanor unbroken despite the rough treatment. She was determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. Thompson's grip was like iron as he pulled her from the car, his fingers digging into her arm as he led her toward the station's entrance. The cold Detroit air bit at her skin, but it wasn't the temperature that made her shiver. It was the stark realization of what was happening, the knowledge that she was being dragged into a system she had spent her life fighting to reform, now as a victim rather than an advocate. Thompson marched her through the station doors, his pace brisk, his focus singular. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed harshly, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow on the worn linoleum floors. The station hummed with activity phones ringing, officers conversing in low tones, the constant undercurrent of a place that never slept. But as they walked past, no one gave them more than a passing glance. To the officers around them, this was routine, just another suspect, another arrest. Linda's identity as a prominent lawyer, someone who had dedicated her life to justice, meant nothing to them in this context. Here, she was just another detainee, another name to be processed. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, Drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me." As Thompson handed her off to the processing officer, he felt a strange emptiness settle over him, a void where the sense of accomplishment usually resided. He had followed the procedure and done what he believed was right, but there was no satisfaction, no closure. The questions that had driven him to this point still lingered, unanswered and unresolved. Linda, on the other hand, stood tall, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. She knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't the end of her story, far from it. It was merely the start of a new chapter, one that she would face with the same unwavering determination that had carried her through every challenge before. As the cell door closed behind her, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the fight that was yet to come. They arrived at the interrogation room, a small, sterile space that exuded an air of oppressive bleakness. The walls were bare, devoid of any distractions, and the single metal table in the center seemed almost too large for the cramped room. Thompson shoved Linda into a cold, unforgiving chair, the metal cuffs digging painfully into her wrists, a physical reminder of the injustice she was enduring. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with the stale odor of long-forgotten coffee lingered in the air, a scent that seemed to seep into the soul, eroding the will of those who had been dragged into this space. It was a place designed to strip people of their defenses, to break them down until they felt small and insignificant. But Linda was neither small nor insignificant. She had spent her life fighting battles far tougher than this, and she wasn't about to be defeated now. Thompson leaned over the table, his face mere inches from hers, his eyes burning with an intensity born from years of unchecked authority. His hands splayed flat on the cold surface, as if trying to assert dominance by sheer physical presence. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he spat, his voice thick with contempt. "Cruising around in that flashy car, acting like you're better than everyone else. But I see through you, lady. You're not fooling anyone." Linda's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes remained locked on his, steady and calm, like the seasoned litigator she was. "I have nothing to hide, officer," she responded. Her voice as measured as it was in courtrooms where she routinely dismantled the arguments of those who underestimated her. "You're making a grave mistake." Thompson's hand slammed down on the table with a force that sent a loud crack echoing through the room. "Mistake? The only mistake here is you thinking you can play innocent with me." He hissed, his words dripping with the bitterness of a man who had long ago let the harsh realities of his job turn him cynical and hardened. "You're a drug dealer," he accused, his voice rising with each word, as if sheer volume could lend credibility to his baseless claim. "You think because you're a lawyer, you're untouchable? Not in my town." Linda didn't so much as flinch. "You have no evidence," she countered, her tone unwavering, her words precise. "This is an unlawful arrest, and deep down, you know it." Her calm defiance only seemed to stoke Thompson's fury. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck strained against the collar of his uniform. "I don't need evidence," he snapped. "I've got years of experience, and I know exactly who you are." But Linda knew better. Experience was not a substitute for truth, and she had built her career on a foundation of facts and integrity. "If you're so sure, then why are we here?" she challenged, her voice steady. "Why not just book me and let a judge decide?" For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in Thompson's eyes, a brief crack in his hardened exterior. But it was gone in an instant, buried beneath the steely resolve that had seen him through countless arrests. He pushed away from the table, pacing the small room like a caged animal, his frustration growing with each step. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to crumble, to break under the pressure, to give him the confession he was so certain would come. Instead, she sat there, unyielding, as calm and composed as if she were the one in control, as if she were the one questioning him. He stopped suddenly, turning back to her with a voice low and menacing, almost a growl. "You're not getting out of this," he warned, his words carrying the weight of a threat. "I'll find something, and when I do, you'll wish you'd never set foot in Detroit." Just as he finished speaking, the door swung open, and another officer stepped inside, clipboard in hand. His expression was one of routine indifference, as if this was just another day, another suspect, another name to process. "Got the paperwork ready for booking," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Thompson nodded, his grip on the situation tightening once more. "Good. Let's get her processed." Linda was yanked to her feet, the cuffs biting into her wrists as they led her out of the interrogation room and into the station's main booking area. The space buzzed with activity officers moving in and out, phones ringing, conversations blending into a low, constant hum. But as Linda passed through, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Heads turned, and whispers followed her wake. Some recognized her, others simply saw another suspect in handcuffs, but all were curious, their eyes tracking her every move. She could feel their judgment, their assumptions hanging in the air, but she paid them no mind. Her focus was sharp, her mind already racing ahead, strategizing, planning her next move. She knew the process: fingerprinting, mugshots, the cold, impersonal questions asked with detached efficiency. But as she went through the motions, her thoughts never wavered from the reality of her situation. This was the system she had fought against for years, the same system she had worked tirelessly to change. And now she was caught in its gears, not as an advocate, but as a victim. But Linda was not the type to be easily broken. She had been underestimated before, and each time she had emerged stronger, more determined. As the camera flashed, capturing her mugshot, she lifted her chin slightly, her eyes burning with a quiet defiance. This wasn't the end for her. It was merely a new battle in a long war she was prepared to fight. As they led her to a holding cell, the metal door clanged shut behind her, sealing her in. But even in that small, confined space, Linda's spirit remained unshaken. She knew what was coming: a legal fight, a battle of wits and wills, and she was ready for it. Thompson might have seen this as just another arrest, but for Linda, it was a challenge, an opportunity to prove once again that justice, true justice, could prevail. She sat on the cold, hard bench, her mind already formulating her strategy, her resolve as firm as the steel bars that now surrounded her. They sat Linda down in front of the booking desk, where an officer, his face lined with fatigue, began the routine task of typing up her information. "Name?" he asked, not bothering to look up from the screen. "Linda Johnson," she responded, her voice steady and composed, despite the situation. The officer's fingers paused above the keyboard, a look of recognition flickering across his features. He glanced up at her, then over at Thompson, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his face set in a grim expression of satisfaction. The officer's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of discomfort, perhaps even doubt. He quickly returned to his work, the clacking of the keys filling the heavy silence as the booking process continued, though the atmosphere in the room had noticeably shifted. Meanwhile, word of Linda Johnson's arrest began to spread like wildfire beyond the station's walls. Phone calls were made, emails sent, and within hours, the news was making its way through the city's legal circles and beyond. Colleagues, friends, and allies who knew Linda not just as a lawyer but as a relentless advocate for justice were stunned by the news. The reaction was swift and fierce. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the first wave of support had already descended upon the police station. Lawyers, activists, and community leaders arrived en masse, their presence a silent but powerful demand for her immediate release and an explanation for the blatant violation of her rights. Outside, the crowd began to swell, their voices rising in anger and indignation. What had started as a few concerned individuals quickly grew into a full-fledged protest. Signs demanding justice for Linda and an end to racial profiling were held high, and chants of Black Lives Matter echoed off the walls of the police station. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with a sense of urgency and a collective refusal to accept the injustice that had unfolded. Inside the station, Thompson began to feel the pressure mounting. He was called into his superior's office, the atmosphere inside far from the victory lap he had anticipated. The chief, a grizzled veteran of the force with decades of experience, didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of authority that Thompson could not ignore. "Do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" the chief asked, his tone edged with something that made Thompson's stomach tighten with unease. Thompson straightened, trying to maintain his composure, though his confidence was beginning to waver. "She's a drug dealer, sir," he insisted, though the words felt hollow now, lacking the conviction they had carried earlier. The chief's eyes narrowed, his gaze hard and unrelenting. "She's not just any lawyer," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Linda Johnson is a high-profile human rights attorney with connections that go far beyond this city. You've just opened a Pandora's box that we may not be able to close." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Thompson felt his heart sink, the full weight of his actions beginning to bear down on him. He had believed he was doing the right thing, but now doubt was creeping in, gnawing at the edges of his certainty. The chief's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, as the reality of the situation began to set in. This was not just another routine arrest, this was something far more complicated, far more dangerous. As Thompson left the chief's office, the station was buzzing with a tension that had taken root since Linda's arrival. Officers moved with purpose, but there was an undercurrent of unease that rippled through the building. Word of Linda's arrest had spread like wildfire, reaching the furthest corners of Detroit and beyond. It wasn't just the local community that was stirring. Lawyers, activists, and even political figures were starting to take notice. Across the city, phones were ringing off the hook in law offices, text messages were being fired off with increasing urgency, and social media was ablaze with the news. The name Linda Johnson, once synonymous with justice and relentless advocacy, was now at the center of a storm that was gaining momentum. People who had long admired her work, who had seen her stand up for the oppressed and give a voice to the voiceless, were rallying to her defense. The mayor, a seasoned politician accustomed to navigating crises, was beginning to feel the heat. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the pressure to act was becoming unbearable. He knew that the public's eyes were on this case, that every move he made would be scrutinized not just by the local press, but by the national media as well. Outside the police station, the crowd had grown exponentially, fed by a collective outrage that only intensified as the hours passed. What had started as a small gathering of supporters had turned into a full-blown protest, a powerful display of solidarity that could not be ignored. The signs demanding justice for Linda and the end of racial profiling were now joined by a chorus of voices calling for accountability and systemic change. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of anger, determination, and a resolute demand for justice. Inside, the station had become a pressure cooker. Thompson could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him from all sides. He was called back into the chief's office, where the mood had only grown more tense. The chief didn't mince words. "Do you understand the magnitude of the situation you've created?" he asked, his voice hard, his eyes boring into Thompson with a seriousness that made his stomach churn. Thompson, for the first time, felt his confidence truly falter. The reality of what he had done was finally sinking in, and with it came a creeping dread that he had made a mistake that could not be easily undone. Linda allowed herself a small, triumphant smile as she stepped out of the station. The plan she had meticulously crafted was now in motion, a strategic battle that would soon capture the nation's attention. Her legal team, a group of seasoned attorneys and advocates, moved with surgical precision, filing the lawsuit against the Detroit Police Department for racial profiling and unlawful arrest. The case was set to become a landmark battle, one that would not only fight for her rights but also challenge the systemic injustices that had been allowed to fester for too long. Within hours, the story had spread like wildfire, splashed across headlines, and broadcast on every major news outlet. Linda Johnson's name and face were now synonymous with resistance and the fight for justice. As the heavy steel door clanged shut behind her, Linda emerged into the cool evening air, her breath mingling with the faint chill that had settled over the city. The crowd that had gathered outside, once a roaring sea of anger and protest, hushed into a tense silence as they watched her step out. The air was thick with anticipation, every gaze fixed on her, waiting for her next move. They knew instinctively that this wasn't the end, this was merely the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of that police station. Linda paused at the top of the station steps, her eyes scanning the diverse faces in the crowd. These weren't just protesters, they were witnesses, allies, and believers in a cause much greater than any single individual. She drew a deep, steadying breath, her mind already churning with the next steps, the legal strategies that would be deployed in the days and weeks to come. She had to keep the momentum going, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been victimized by a corrupt system. "Thank you for your support," she called out, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the night air like a beacon. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been wronged by a system that should have protected them. The fight for justice is far from over. It's only just begun." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices swelling into a powerful chorus of unity and determination. Signs were lifted higher, chants of justice for Linda rang out louder, and the atmosphere crackled with an electric sense of purpose. Linda knew that this moment would send shockwaves throughout the city, rattling the halls of power where complacency and corruption had long reigned. And those in power were right to be worried. The pressure was building, and it wouldn't be long before it reached a breaking point. As Linda made her way through the supportive throng, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message from Sarah, her trusted colleague and close friend. "We've got something. Call me ASAP." Linda's pulse quickened as she slipped into the back seat of her car, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. With a quick tap, she dialed Sarah's number, her mind racing with possibilities. Sarah's voice came through the line, breathless and urgent. "You won't believe this. We received an anonymous package, a set of documents that blows the whole case wide open. It's about those boys in Thompson. It's so much worse than we thought." Linda's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she listened, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. "What do you mean? What did you find?" "The documents." "The documents," Sarah continued, her voice charged with excitement, "detail a conspiracy to frame those kids. Thompson and several other officers were involved, planting evidence, coercing witnesses, and falsifying reports. It's all in there, Linda, and it doesn't stop with Thompson. It implicates people higher up in the department. This corruption goes all the way to the top." Linda's breath hitched, the enormity of what Sarah was saying taking a moment to fully register. She had suspected corruption, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Are you sure? Are these documents legitimate?" Linda asked, her mind already strategizing the next steps. "Absolutely," Sarah confirmed without hesitation. "I've reviewed them myself, and they're rock solid. We even have recordings, conversations between Thompson and his team, talking about how they were going to set those boys up. Linda, this is the smoking gun we've been looking for." 1,000 thoughts raced through Linda's mind as she considered the significance of this revelation. These documents didn't just confirm her suspicions, they offered a direct path to dismantling the deep-seated corruption that had plagued the police department for years. But she knew that pursuing this would be perilous. The people implicated in these documents were powerful, and exposing them meant putting everything on the line: her career, her safety, and the lives of those around her. But Linda also knew that this was why she had become a lawyer in the first place, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to challenge the systems that perpetuated injustice. This was the battle she was meant to fight, and she wasn't going to back down now. "Sarah," Linda said, her voice calm but resolute, "we're going to bring this to light. Every single bit of it. But we need to be smart, and we need to be prepared for whatever comes next. This is going to be a war." On the other end of the line, Sarah's voice was filled with determination. "We're ready, Linda. Let's take them down." Linda ended the call, her resolve hardening like steel. The fight ahead was daunting, but she was prepared to face it head-on. She knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for every person who had been wronged, every voice that had been silenced. The battle lines were drawn, and Linda Johnson was ready to lead the charge. "All right," Linda finally said, her voice unwavering as her resolve solidified. "We need to act swiftly. We'll build our case, but we can't stop there. This needs to go public. Everyone must know the truth. We're not just fighting for those boys anymore, we're taking on an entire corrupt system." Sarah's agreement was resolute, and with the plan set, the call ended. Linda sat in her car for a few moments longer, the magnitude of their task weighing heavily on her mind. This wasn't just about winning in court, it was about dismantling a fortress of lies that had shielded the powerful for too long. And Linda was ready, more determined than ever, to see it through. The next morning, the city of Detroit woke to a firestorm. The headlines blared with words like corruption, conspiracy, and betrayal. Evidence emerges in shocking police scandal. Officers caught framing innocent youths became the talk of every news channel. Social media erupted, with "Justice for Linda" trending nationwide within hours. Interviews with Linda's legal team aired on major networks, each detail of the anonymous documents exposing the depths of the corruption laid bare for the world to see. Detroit was a city on edge. Protests swelled in numbers, the streets echoing with the chants of people who demanded justice not just for Linda, but for every victim of the corrupt system that had finally been dragged into the light. The pressure on city officials, including the mayor and police chief, was intense. They could no longer sidestep the growing calls for accountability. The situation had become a crisis, and the city's leaders were being held to account in a way they had never anticipated. Linda sat in her office, the dim glow of her computer screen illuminating the stacks of legal documents surrounding her. Each file, each piece of paper, was now a weapon in the battle she was waging. The anonymous documents had not just confirmed her worst suspicions, they had blown the doors off a scandal that had been festering for years. The decision to go public had not been easy. The risks were immense: potential retaliation, attempts to smear her reputation, or even efforts to bury the evidence. But Linda knew that the truth had to come out. The media was their most powerful ally in this fight, and with the world watching, there was no turning back. The lawsuit against the Detroit Police Department was filed quickly and decisively. The case was scheduled for trial, and the courtroom was set to become the battleground where the future of the city's law enforcement would be decided. This trial wasn't just another case, it was a reckoning. The days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of activity. Linda's office transformed into a war room, her legal team working tirelessly to prepare. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight, every legal argument needed to be crafted with precision. They knew the defense would come at them with everything they had, trying to poke holes in their case, but Linda and her team were ready for the challenge. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courthouse was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists crowded the entrance, their cameras poised to capture every moment as Linda and her team made their way inside. The streets outside were lined with protesters, their chants a steady, powerful reminder of what was at stake. Linda entered the courtroom, her head held high, surrounded by her team of dedicated lawyers. The significance of this moment was not lost on her. This trial was about far more than just winning a legal battle. It was about restoring faith in a justice system that had been twisted by those sworn to protect it. The eyes of the nation were on her, and she was ready to lead the charge. As the trial began, Linda felt a surge of determination. This was the moment she had been fighting for, the culmination of her life's work. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, but she welcomed it. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. The people were with her, the truth was on her side, and she was prepared to see this fight through to the end. The courtroom was silent as the first witness was called, and Linda felt a calm resolve settle over her. The battle had begun, and she was ready to win. The trial commenced with the typical fanfare of opening statements, the defense attempting to undermine Linda's case before it could gain traction. They framed her lawsuit as a baseless vendetta, a narrative concocted by a woman with a personal grudge, eager to smear the police through sensationalized media coverage. But when Linda's team stepped up, they let the facts do the talking. With a precision honed by countless courtroom battles, they laid out their evidence methodically, each piece fitting perfectly into the larger picture of systemic corruption. Witnesses began to take the stand, the defense parading their experts to discredit the damning evidence presented by Linda's team. But each expert faltered under the relentless cross-examination, their arguments unraveling as Linda's lawyers exposed the holes in their testimonies. The truth was a powerful weapon, and it was on full display. The pivotal moment of the trial came when Linda's team introduced the recording's secret conversations between Officer Thompson and his fellow conspirators. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the audio played, the voices of the officers ringing out in the hushed space. Their words were chilling, casual discussions about planting evidence and ensuring the conviction of the innocent young men they had framed. Thompson's voice, once so confident, now sounded sinister, and as his own words echoed through the courtroom, his face drained of color. The weight of his actions became inescapable. As the trial progressed, it was clear that the tide had turned. The defense was floundering, their narrative collapsing under the weight of the undeniable evidence. And then, in a dramatic twist, the defense called a surprise witness, Captain David Harrison, a senior officer within the Detroit Police Department. His appearance sent a ripple of tension through the courtroom, the atmosphere thickening as he took the stand. Linda watched him intently, knowing that his testimony could tip the scales in either direction. Harrison, known for his integrity and unflinching honesty, began his testimony with a measured tone, each word carefully chosen. "I've served in the Detroit Police Department for over 2 decades," he started, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "What I'm about to say is difficult, but it's something that must be said. This department is filled with dedicated officers, men and women who joined to serve their community, to protect the innocent. But unfortunately, some have strayed from that path, who have let power corrupt their judgment." The room was spellbound as Harrison continued, revealing that he had conducted his internal investigation, an investigation he had kept secret out of fear that reporting it through official channels would only lead to a cover-up. "The evidence I've seen," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of his words, "makes it clear that Officer Thompson and others have not only betrayed their oath, but have committed serious crimes against the citizens they swore to protect." Harrison's testimony landed like a bombshell, shattering the defense's carefully constructed narrative. His words were not just the testimony of a witness, they were a confession from within the system itself, exposing a rot that ran deep through the ranks. The courtroom was electrified, the carefully maintained facade of the Detroit Police Department crumbling under the weight of truth. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together as she absorbed the impact of Harrison's revelations. She had seen the ugly side of the justice system before, but even she was taken aback by the depth of the corruption Harrison had uncovered. This wasn't just about Thompson or even the officers directly involved, it was about an entire system that had been perverted by those at the highest levels, individuals who had manipulated their positions for personal gain, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. The contrast between the two tables in the courtroom was stark. On one side, Linda's team sat with a quiet determination, the weight of the truth now fully on their side. On the other, the defense was in disarray. Thompson sat slumped in his chair, his once cocky demeanor replaced by a hollow stare. The realization of what he had done, the lives he had destroyed, and the consequences he would now face were crashing down on him with the force of a tidal wave. His career was not just over, his very identity, the foundation of who he believed he was, had been shattered beyond repair. As the trial moved towards its conclusion, the outcome seemed increasingly certain. Linda's case was no longer just about those innocent boys, or even about her unlawful arrest. It had become a battle for the soul of the city. And in that battle, the truth was proving to be the most formidable weapon of all. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. For years, Rick Thompson had believed he was the protector, the vigilant shield standing between the citizens of Detroit and the chaos that threatened their streets. He had convinced himself that his actions were noble, that he was doing his duty to keep the city safe. But now, sitting in the courtroom as the truth unraveled before him, he saw it all for what it was: a cruel, twisted lie. He had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. A game orchestrated by those who wielded power not to protect, but to control, manipulate, and destroy. As Thompson's thoughts spiraled, he replayed the years he had spent on the force in his mind, the long, sleepless nights, the dangerous calls that had pushed him to the edge, the fleeting moments of doubt that he had always forced himself to suppress. He had told himself that what he was doing was right, that his actions were justified in the name of law and order. But now, with the clarity that only comes from a shattered illusion, he saw the dark threads that connected his every move to the corrupt decisions made by the higher-ups: Assistant Chief Reynolds, Councilman Brooks, and others who had used him as a tool in their insidious schemes. Assistant Chief Reynolds, a man Thompson had once admired and respected, had orchestrated the framing of innocent young men, turning them into criminals to make the department's crime statistics look more impressive. It was all part of a broader strategy to make the department appear more effective, to justify the funding and the accolades that came with it. And Brooks, the cunning city councilman, had ensured that the department received the resources it needed by manipulating those very statistics, regardless of the human cost. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on Thompson as the full weight of his actions settled over him. He realized now that he wasn't just a passive participant in this corruption, he had been an active instrument of it. Every arrest he had made, every suspect he had dragged into custody, had been another step in a meticulously orchestrated dance of deceit. He had been blinded by his own biases, by his belief that he was making a difference, by the illusion of righteousness that had been carefully constructed around him. His breathing grew shallow, ragged, as the enormity of his actions bore down on him like a physical force. He sank lower in his seat, the images of the young men he had wronged flashing through his mind like a tormenting reel. Their faces, their desperate pleas for justice that he had dismissed as the cries of the guilty, they haunted him now. He had reduced them to mere statistics, victories in the war on crime. But in reality, they were victims of a system that had used and discarded them just as it had used and discarded him. Across the courtroom, Linda watched Thompson closely, her gaze piercing through the turmoil that was visible on his face. She saw the guilt, the anguish, the dawning comprehension of just how deep the corruption ran. And while she felt a twinge of empathy for the man who was now realizing the full extent of his complicity, she also understood that this moment, this crushing weight of realization, was crucial. Without it, there could be no real justice. Rick Thompson sat at the defense table, his posture defeated, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. The man who had entered this trial with such confidence, believing in the righteousness of his actions, had been systematically dismantled by the truth. Every word of Captain Harrison's damning testimony had driven home the reality of Thompson's role in a corrupt system. The conspiracy had been laid bare, and Thompson was left to confront the bitter truth he had been an enforcer of a lie. The guilt that consumed him was all-encompassing, a relentless force that stripped him of everything he had once believed in: his pride, his sense of duty, his very identity. As the trial edged closer to its conclusion, the defense made a final, desperate attempt to salvage what little remained of Thompson's reputation. They tried to portray him as a man who had simply followed orders and who had been misled by those in positions of greater authority. But it was clear to everyone in that courtroom that this defense was hollow. Thompson had made his own choices, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Finally, it was Linda's turn to address the court. She rose from her seat, her movements calm and deliberate, embodying the quiet strength that had carried her through this grueling trial. The room fell silent as she made her way to the front, the gravity of the moment palpable in the air. She stood before the jury, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering as she prepared to deliver her final remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Linda began, her voice resonating with the weight of the truth she was about to speak. "This case is about more than just the actions of one man. It's about a system that has been corrupted from the inside out. A system that has failed the very people it was meant to protect. Rick Thompson is not the only one on trial here today. The entire structure that allowed this to happen is on trial, and it is up to us, up to you, to ensure that justice is served." She paused, letting her words sink in, before continuing with a quiet intensity that commanded the room. "We have heard the evidence, we have seen the proof. Innocent lives were destroyed, manipulated, and cast aside by those who abused their power. This cannot stand. We must hold those responsible accountable, not just for the sake of the victims, but for the future of the city, for the integrity of our justice system." Linda's eyes swept across the courtroom, meeting the gaze of each juror, each person who had the power to shape the outcome of this trial. "The decisions you make here will have lasting consequences. They will determine whether we allow this corruption to continue or whether we take a stand and say no more. I ask you to consider the evidence, to consider the evidence, to consider the lives that have been impacted, and to deliver a verdict that reflects the truth we have uncovered here today." With that, Linda returned to her seat, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The courtroom remained silent, the gravity of the moment pressing down on everyone present. It was clear that this trial, this fight for justice, had transcended the individual players. It had become a battle for the soul of the city, a test of whether truth and justice could prevail over corruption and deceit. And now, the fate of that battle rested in the hands of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Linda began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had been revealed in the course of the trial. Her eyes moved deliberately over the faces of the jurors, ensuring that each one understood the gravity of what she was about to say. "This trial has brought to light something that many have long suspected, but few have dared to confront head-on. It has shown us that the system of justice we rely on, a system that is supposed to be the bedrock of our society, has been compromised by those who seek to exploit it for their ends. We have laid bare the evidence of this corruption, and we have seen firsthand the devastating consequences it has wrought upon the lives of innocent people." Linda paused, allowing the silence to underscore the importance of her words. "But this trial is about more than just holding those responsible to account. It is about something far more profound. It is about restoring our faith in the rule of law, about reaffirming that our justice system must serve the people it was created to protect. It is about sending an unequivocal message to anyone who would dare to abuse their power. We will not stand by and allow it to happen. Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done." Her voice, though measured, resonated with a deep emotional current, a quiet but fierce resolve that filled the room with a palpable sense of purpose. "The individuals standing trial today are not the only ones responsible for the injustices we have uncovered. They are part of a much larger, systemic problem that we must all work together to address. But here, in this courtroom, we have the chance to take the first step toward meaningful change. We have the chance to show that justice is not an abstract concept, but a living, breathing principle, one that we must uphold, no matter the personal or collective cost. Linda's eyes briefly locked with Thompson's, and in that brief moment she saw the pain etched into his face, the weight of regret that now burdened him. But she also saw something deeper, a flicker of understanding, a recognition of the truth he could no longer deny. As Linda returned to her seat, the judge called for the final statements. The defense's closing argument was a subdued and lackluster attempt to salvage what little remained of their case. It was clear to everyone present that the tide irrevocably turned and that justice was finally within reach. The jury's deliberations stretched on for hours, the enormity of their task evident in the time they took. When they finally returned, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The foreman stood, holding the fate of those on trial in his hands. In the silence that followed, he announced the verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of shocked gasps, murmured conversations, and a few scattered cheers of vindication. The verdict was a hard-won victory, but it also served as a stark reminder of the long road that still lay ahead. As the judge read out the sentences, the guilty were led away in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of resignation and defeat. Thompson was the last to be escorted from the courtroom. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step required all the strength he had left to muster. When he reached the edge of the gallery, he paused, turning to face the public that had witnessed his dramatic fall from grace. For what felt like an eternity, Thompson stood there, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had watched him fall. And then, in a gesture that conveyed both an acknowledgement of his guilt and a desperate plea for some form of redemption, Thompson bowed his head, a deep, sorrowful bow that conveyed more than words ever could. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as he was led away, the door closing behind him with a finality that reverberated through the room. In the days that followed the trial's conclusion, Linda found herself at the epicenter of a whirlwind of attention. The trial had been heralded as a landmark case, a watershed moment in the ongoing struggle against systemic corruption and racial injustice. News outlets across the country celebrated the victory, hailing Linda as a champion of justice. Her office was inundated with letters of support from all corners of the nation, and the phone never seemed to stop ringing. Among the flood of calls were numerous offers, positions in prestigious organizations, and opportunities to elevate her fight to a national platform. One offer, in particular, stood out. It came from a major human rights organization renowned for its tireless efforts in pushing for police reform across the country. They wanted Linda to spearhead a new initiative, a nationwide campaign aimed at addressing the very issues she had confronted in Detroit. The role would give her an unprecedented platform, a chance to influence policies on a scale that could transform the lives of countless individuals across the United States. Linda sat in her office, staring at the offer letter in front of her. The magnitude of the decision weighed heavily on her shoulders. It was an extraordinary opportunity, one that aligned perfectly with her passions and the work she had dedicated her life to. But with that opportunity came enormous responsibility and the need to consider what it would mean for her and Detroit. As she contemplated the decision, her thoughts inevitably turned to Detroit, the city that had been both her battleground and her home. Detroit was where she had fought and won some of the most significant cases of her career, and now, thanks to the trial, the seeds of change had begun to sprout. There were early signs of reform, new policies under discussion, committees forming to ensure accountability, and a renewed sense of hope in the community. It felt as though the city was starting to heal, slowly and cautiously, but with a resolve that echoed her own. Yet Linda couldn't shake the feeling that her work in Detroit was far from complete. Could she leave now when the city still needed her guidance? Or was it time to leverage the momentum she had gained and drive change on a broader scale, reaching beyond Detroit to address the systemic issues that plagued the entire nation. The answer didn't come in a single moment of clarity, but emerged gradually as she reflected on her journey, on everything she had witnessed and experienced. The fight for justice wasn't limited to one city, one courtroom, or even one case. It was a battle that spanned the nation, and if she could make a difference on a larger scale, she felt a responsibility to do so. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't simply abandon Detroit. The city was in her blood, and its people were her people. With this realization, Linda made her decision. She would accept the role, but she would do so on her terms. She would ensure that the progress made in Detroit continued, and that the reforms she had fought so hard for would be implemented and sustained. She would divide her time, remaining deeply connected to the grassroots work in Detroit while pushing for broader reforms on the national stage. When news of her decision spread, the response was overwhelmingly positive. The announcement of her new role was met with enthusiasm and optimism, as it became clear that her influence would now extend far beyond the city that had been her battleground. Yet, Detroit remained her anchor, and she returned often, overseeing the implementation of the changes she had championed. It was during one of these visits that Linda received an unexpected request to meeting with Rick Thompson. The request surprised her, but she agreed to meet him, unsure of what to expect. They met in the stark confines of a prison visiting room, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Thompson looked older, more haggard, the burden of his actions etched deeply into the lines of his face. He sat across from her, his posture slouched, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as though the words themselves were difficult to form. "I wanted to see you," he began, his eyes not quite meeting hers, "to tell you something I've never told anyone." Linda remained silent, giving him the space to continue. She could sense that whatever he was about to say was weighing heavily on him, perhaps more than anything else he had carried with him over the years. Thompson took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together on the table. "I've had a lot of time to think in here," he said slowly, "to go over everything that happened, everything I did. And I've come to realize that I wasn't just following orders. I chose to do those things. I let myself believe that I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting people. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I was scared, Linda. Scared of losing my job, my reputation, scared of what it would mean if I didn't fall in line." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of breaking down. "I justified it to myself by saying I was following orders, that it wasn't my place to question those above me. But deep down I knew better. I knew what we were doing was wrong, and I did it anyway. And now I have to live with that." Linda watched him, her expression unreadable. She had seen many people break down in this very room, but this felt different. This was a man who had been stripped of everything, now confronting the very core of who he was and finding it wanting. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Thompson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I just needed to say it out loud. To admit that I was wrong, that I failed those kids, failed the people I was supposed to protect. I see that now, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of his confession. Linda took a deep breath, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had fought so hard to expose the truth, to bring justice to those who had been wronged. And now, sitting across from her was one of the very men she had fought against, a man who had played a part in the corruption she had sought to dismantle. But in this moment she saw not just the man who had done wrong, but also the man who was trying, in his way, to make amends. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done, but it was a small step toward redemption. "Thank you for telling me this," Rick, Linda finally said, her voice steady. "It doesn't change what happened, but it means something that you've acknowledged it. I hope you continue to reflect on your actions and find a way to make amends, even if it's just within yourself." Thompson nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I will," he said softly. "I promise I will." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. As she left the prison that day, Linda felt a strange sense of closure. The battle in Detroit had been long and hard, but it was over now. And while there were still many more battles to fight, she knew that she had made the right choice. She would continue her work on a national level, pushing for the reforms that were so desperately needed. But she would never forget where it all started in the streets of Detroit, a city that had shaped her, challenged her, and ultimately made her who she was. Linda listened intently, her expression carefully neutral, as Thompson revealed the deepest wound of his past, the tragic story of his fiancée, a woman he had loved with all his heart, whose life had been cruelly taken from him just days before their wedding. She had been killed by a black man in a senseless act of violence, and the grief that had followed had consumed him, twisting into a hatred that he had carried like a festering wound. That hatred had seeped into every aspect of his life, particularly into his work as a police officer, fueling the actions that had brought so much pain to others. Thompson's voice was barely more than a whisper as he confessed, "I couldn't see it then. I was blinded by my anger, by my pain. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting others, but I was wrong. I see that now, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." Linda sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his words. She could see the raw truth in his eyes, the deep pain that had driven him to such darkness, and the overwhelming regret that now burdened him. Yet, while she could understand the roots of his actions, she knew that understanding did not equate to excusing them. The damage he had caused was irreparable. The lives he had destroyed could never be restored. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, measured, compassionate yet firm. "What happened to you was a tragedy, Rick, and I am truly sorry for your loss. But you let that pain turn into something poisonous, something that not only destroyed you but hurt so many others in the process. It's not my place to forgive you. That's a journey you'll have to take on your own." Thompson nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had come seeking absolution, a way to ease the guilt that had become his constant companion. But now he understood that such absolution would not be easily found if it could be found at all. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation, "for listening." Linda rose from her seat, ready to leave, but she hesitated at the door. She turned back to him, her voice soft but resolute. "We all have our burdens to carry, Rick. It's how we choose to carry them that defines who we are." With that, she walked away, feeling a sense of closure not just for herself, but for the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the challenges she would face were still daunting, but she felt ready to meet them head-on. The fight for justice was far from over, but with every step she took, she knew she was moving closer to a world where justice was not just an ideal but a reality for all. As she stepped outside and looked over the city she had fought so hard for, Linda felt a renewed sense of purpose. Detroit had been her battleground, but the struggle for justice extended far beyond its borders. She would continue to fight not just for Detroit, but for every community and every person who had ever been wronged by a system that had failed them. Her work was not done until justice and equality were more than just dreams but lived realities for everyone. What a journey Linda Johnson has taken us on. From the gritty, tough streets of Detroit to the powerful halls of justice, we've seen her evolve from a passionate lawyer fighting for the oppressed to a national symbol of justice and reform. Linda's story isn't just about winning a courtroom battle. It's about the deep emotional struggle to overcome both personal and systemic pain. Her ability to confront corruption head-on while still holding on to her humanity teaches us a powerful lesson about resilience, about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And then there's Thompson, a man haunted by his past, whose tragic loss led him down a dark and destructive path. His story is a reminder that while our past shapes us, it doesn't have to define us forever. Redemption is possible, but it requires an honest reckoning with one's actions, a willingness to confront the darkness within, and the courage to seek out the light. In the end, Linda's fight was not just for justice in a courtroom, it was for the soul of a city, and for the countless lives that depend on the integrity of the systems meant to protect them. Her journey reminds us all of the importance of courage, compassion, and an unyielding commitment to the truth. As we come to the end of Linda Johnson's powerful journey, we're left with profound lessons about justice, resilience, and the importance of confronting our pain and biases. Linda's story teaches us that the fight for justice is never easy, but it's a battle worth fighting, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has been wronged by a system that should protect them. We've also seen how even the deepest wounds can lead us down dark paths if we don't address them with honesty and courage, as Rick Thompson's story so painfully reminds us. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What have you learned from Linda's story? What is one thing you've taken away from this journey that you'll bring into practice in your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories that inspire and challenge us to make a difference. Thank you for watching.